supporting parents and supporting new moms and families is not the same as increasing the birth rate. It's important to keep those. Some of them kind of overlap in terms of policies, but for the most part, they're distinct conversations, and we should be open about that. And if you're concerned about birth rates, which I think we all should be, then it is much more of a cultural conversation.
Welcome to Inside Policy Talks, the podcast of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm Peter Copeland, Deputy Director of Domestic Policy here at MLI, and today we are talking about family policy. In both Canada and the United States, the family has become an increasingly fragile institution. Fertility is in free fall, marriage is delayed or foregone entirely in some cases, and economic pressures often discourage young people from having children, to say nothing of the cultural pressures. And meanwhile, tax and welfare systems continue to treat families as atomized individuals rather than as the social units that they in fact are. And so this sets up the big policy questions about family formation and national well-being. And our guest today has been looking closely at these issues. Patrick T. Brown is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, where he works on family policy and economic opportunity. Patrick was a senior policy advisor to Congress's Joint Economic Committee, where he helped lead its social capital project, and he's definitely emerged as one of the leading voices articulating family-supportive public policy. And at MLI, we've also been making the case that public policy must serve, not ignore, the foundational institutions of society, foremost among them families, alongside communities and civil society. And so I think it's fair to say that it's hard to imagine a policy issue more central to our long-term well-being. And before we get started, I just want to say a quick plug to please remember to like and subscribe. It really helps us reach more people with these important ideas. Patrick, welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. Greetings from down south across the border.
Yeah, great to have you. So we're going to be comparing today. But before we do, let's set the stage. Why family policy matters. Why should governments care about it? Is it something that is the purview of government, or is it more so something in the realm of, individual choice, a private matter? I can think that it was kind of unexamined for a long time, perhaps when it wasn't a problem. And then certainly there have been some ideological shifts that prioritize maybe the latter approach to the question of it being something of the realm of pure unfettered choice. What do you make of it?
No, your intro really set it up. I think once you start thinking about the point of a society and the point of a civilization, really, it very quickly emerges that the family quickly emerges as the cornerstone. If you don't have a healthy family as an institution, so many other things in society break down, as we see here in the US, and you guys have examples up in Canada as well. And we see this across the globe, right? And I think for a long time, conversations around family policy in the West specifically, for the last half century, maybe really focused on the rise of out of wedlock births here in the US specifically. But again, we saw this elsewhere as well, where used to be the vast majority of the kids were born in a two-parent household. The concern was, we're having too many babies being born to single moms. We're going to have welfare dependency and all the, sort of social ills that come along with that. And so that tended to be where most family policy conversations focused, was how do we restore marriage and reduce, dependency on welfare. And I think in the early 2000s, Canada and the US kind of diverged a little bit in this conversation, where you guys introduced the CCB. The US has had a different approach that we can talk about. But now I think the conversation is shifting again, where it's no longer, how do we get more babies born inside of marriage? It's also, how do we get more babies born at all? And that comes down to marriage, but it's not limited to that, because I think even among married couples, even though fertility is fairly flat, maybe a little bit down, but the biggest decrease in the U.S. in childbirth has been among unmarried women since the Great Recession or so. Even for married couples, there's a sense that childbearing has become too painful, too difficult, too costly, both in terms of out of pocket cost as well as the opportunity cost of what you have to give up. And so, if you're concerned about the long term trajectory of, certainly, national, well-being, and but also just like the actuarial tables for entitlement programs and social security and all the rest, you have to be concerned about what it says about a society that is scraping the bottom of the barrel when it comes to fertility rates and the number of babies being born.
Mhm. Well, interesting you say that the focus has shifted from forming healthy families to having children at all, because and you note how connected they are, because indeed marriage is one of the greatest predictors of fertility, and of course it is the natural and best approach to support children. But I want to say that we didn't fare so well on the first focus, because yeah, there was a peak in divorces, kind of after the sexual revolution and change to divorce laws. But now we just have fewer people getting married and higher rates of cohabitation. So let's unpack this fertility question, as you rightly note, is kind of the biggest issue now. It's not just social, it's economic. You referred to the dependencies upon on children and a stable workforce for all of our entitlement programs. Um, it's one of these areas where there are a lot of theories and factors in play. And I think in reality, we know in social science, it's always the case. There's never a single root cause. But what are the most salient ones? I note rising individualism, the advent of birth control and abortion, moves away from the institution of marriage, from maybe feminism and some of the LGBT movement stuff. Secularism is another one. Many factors in play. How do you think about this? What are the most salient ones?
Yeah, no, it is. There's no. It's like the is it Murder on the Orient Express, where there's 12 culprits who each stab the victim. There's not one cause, obviously, when you're talking about something as global as the decline in
Right.
fertility is. And so, some of the few, some of the many, I should say, a few of the many are obviously marriage. I think you can't understand the decline in fertility without understanding the decline in marriage. And we see that again. I'm most familiar with the U.S., but we see it elsewhere as well. The sort of breakdown between the sexes, and I think this is especially poisonous right now if you're trying to get married as a young 20 something Gen Z type person in the age of rampant online pornography and red pill ideology and all the rest that really drives a wedge between young men and young women. That's clearly a factor, not the only factor, but one of them. And I think another that you touched on is rates of marriage were much higher when we had a more religious population, and as secularism increases, the sort of non-monetary value that people put on marriage, that sort of theological or sacramental idea of marriage, really disappears from the scene on the whole. Now, again, there's still people getting married. That's great. We should encourage them to. But when you're thinking about it in just sort of materialistic terms, we do have marriage penalties here in the US and the tax and transfer programs, where if you're a cohabitating couple, you can often get more in terms of, safety net benefits, whether that's food support or health insurance or even the way you're taxed, or you get a low wage benefit. You can receive more in benefits from the federal or state government if you're unmarried than if you do decide to get married. And so that puts a thumb on the scale, encouraging people to see marriage as, if this is just a piece of paper and I can get more, food on the table for my kids by remaining unmarried, then why would I get married in the first place? So that's a very real concern. And then I do think this sort of loss of the family, like you're saying, with all the sort of cultural trends to push us towards the idea of marriage as just being one life path among any other. Yeah, you can get married, you can stay cohabitated, you can marry a tree, you can marry four people, whatever it is to you, that's what marriage and family means to, society. I think that's been that sort of idea of family diversity that you hear talked about in more progressive leaning circles. I think that saps some of the normative motivation behind people getting married. If there were plenty of problems with society in the 1960s and 70s, but the predominant vision for most people was you're going to get, graduate high school, get married, go on and have kids. That was sort of standard. And now I think once you sort of lose that sense that this is something that most people do, uh, it really requires a proactive affirmative choice for people to get married, and I think we're seeing the outcome of that. And
Mhm.
so maybe it's smartphones, maybe it's mass media, maybe it's ideology. All of these are sort of a complex brew, but you're
Mhm.
seeing it play out. The US, Canada, Europe, Japan, Singapore, you can basically everywhere it's sub-Saharan Africa, you're
Mhm.
seeing the same pattern exert itself.
Yeah, well, one of the things we're going to seize upon a bit in the comparison is the fact that the US is higher than many Western and industrialized countries. Israel tops the charts, and France and Hungary are also interesting, but the US is high, and I, attribute that a good deal of it anyway to the embedded religiosity. And well, you allow income splitting, but that's kind of a minor thing. It's this deeper, kind of pronatal beliefs that I think are pretty important. Before we shift to the comparison, though, Pat, I want to ask you, because it's one thing to point to the factors, the many factors that are influencing the declines, but what are some examples of those, let's call them types of people or community types that are bucking the trend and that have, strong marriage and family formation, higher fertility? What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, the one that everybody always points to is one you mentioned, Israel. They seem to have bucked the trend. I think part of that is because, as we've seen since October 7th, 2023, they're in an existential fight for survival. They have been for a long time, and that's embedded in the culture. A very tight knit society that has a lot to fight for, and so that seems to boost fertility in a very real way. Also, the fact that you do have a very prominent segment of the population that sort of shifts the norm in terms of ultra orthodox families having lots more kids than most places in the West. Even secular Jewish citizens end up having more kids than secular, French or Dutch or American or Canadian residents. And so I think there's something to be said for the sort of spillover effects of having people visibly outside the norm pushing that sort of Overton window of, well, I guess we could have a kid or two rather than none. Um, Within the US, there's also small segments of the population. Again, very religious folks, not surprisingly, tend to have larger families. There's certainly evidence that you know there there's something about, well, we can get into this a little bit, but it's for a long time it was the case that people with lower education tended to go to church more, and now that relationship seems to have been flipped, and so there's an interesting uh, divergence happening where more educated Americans tend to be the ones who are getting married and going to church, which I think will be interesting. It plays into that discussion that we were having earlier about the breakdown of the family and the concern there. Um, that pattern is going to continue to shift over time, where the breakdown of marriage is heavily concentrated among non-college
Yes.
educated and non-religious Americans predominantly.
Yeah, and that's of course connected to the economic situation and lack of availability of, good paying, solid, stable, often industrial jobs that have been shifting overseas. So let's talk now about the differences between Canada and U.S. So yeah, it's a checkered landscape. We do some things well here, and others not so much, and vice versa. Um, so I want to focus on childcare, on family policies broadly, and just see what you think of our situation. And I know you've just helped bring forward a child tax credit in the U.S. So we have lots to discuss. So our system, I mean, you alluded to it. We have the Canada Child Benefit, which is a cash benefit for parents with children. I think it's good in many respects because it provides that choice, that direct payment. It's not subsidizing a specific activity. We know that that works. Yet on the other hand, our tax system is individualistic. There's no income splitting. You can't average across the family. And we've also introduced a national childcare system, which has created a lot of supply issues and perhaps even incentivized dual income earning, which we know can harm home and family life a little bit. So that's just a bit about the Canadian system, an overview for you, if you will. Would love to get your thoughts on what you know about Canada's system and then how it compares to the US.
Yeah, I'll tackle those in reverse order. First, I think the is it $10 a day, $7 a day, whatever it is happens to be at the time. Childcare model is one that really is based off the needs of the sort of dual income professional class couple that that you referenced. They're the ones who prefer to have both parents working full time, at least in the again speaking from the U.S. But I think there's similarities, especially in Toronto, Vancouver, and some of the bigger urban areas in Canada. They're the ones who are trying to balance, having it all, so to speak. And so to them, free full time or very reduced cost full time childcare is really beneficial. But when you survey parents across the landscape who aren't necessarily gunning for that corner office promotion and the making partner at the law firm and all the rest, you find a much more varied and diverse set of preferences, especially for moms, but some dads too, who say I'd really prefer to be working part-time or even not at all when my kids are really young, and subsidized childcare doesn't do anything for me. And there is that nudge on the scale in order to benefit most fully from a scheme like in Canada or the UK is trying to roll out. You have to have both parents working full time for it to make the most financial sense, if that's the way you set it up. But it doesn't have to be that way. And that's why I do like the structure of the CCB in theory. Now, I have some issues with how it phases out, and it's really focused on the lowest income families first and foremost. And then as you get in the middle class, you really start to see it drop off for larger families. I think that's probably a mistake. I'd like to see something that's probably maybe a little less generous, but more universal across the board. But that idea where we're saying let's give parents the resources to make the choice that's right for them, and then we can look at the supply side. Again, you mentioned when you roll this program out, huge supply crunches, and especially in BC and other high cost areas of living. That's a and then the solution is, well, we just got to fund it more, and it's like it just becomes this sort of hamster wheel of you can never fund childcare enough because you've created a system that's in some respects designed to boost wages rather than boost family life, but wages for childcare workers. And so I think that's a mistake. The CCB the direction is right, and there's things that the U.S. doesn't quite get right. We can talk about where our child tax credit doesn't quite go as far as the model there does, but in theory, that's something that I like a lot better about the Canadian system, is saying let's try to recognize that parents have costs that non-parents don't, that they're incurring the burden of essentially propagating the human species, for the next generation. We should give them some relief, but we shouldn't be putting our thumb on the scale about what model it needs to look like in order to merit that relief. I think that's the right way to go about it.
Right. Can I just interject quickly there, Pat? Because it's a good compare and contrast. Obviously, the U.S. does not have national child care, nor do I think they should move in that direction. But we don't have a tax credit, and we have the cash subsidy instead. So I'm wondering, and perhaps advocating for this here in Canada, whether we try to replace some of the national daycare with a child tax credit. And maybe you can now shed some light on what's going on there with that in the U.S. and what the U.S. Offers or may offer on the cash subsidy side, and your thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of accounting problem, right? Because from the government's perspective, $1,000 in a cash subsidy is $1,000 in a foregone tax credit, right? It's all the same
Yeah.
from the perspective of the federal, bookkeepers. But in the U.S., particularly over the last couple decades, there's been a real emphasis on let's make this tied to work. It's a really, it's been a value, especially for conservatives, but even across the spectrum. The idea that we want to be encouraging families to have someone working is really important for U.S. policymakers. And this is something that I think they would say the Canadian system gets wrong by making it fully refundable, even for very low income households. You end up running the risk of sort of people, perpetuating people and sort of just getting by rather than investing and trying to get back into the labor force. It's a complex question. I don't know if there's a one right answer to it, but that's why the U.S. system has traditionally been focused more on reducing taxes owed rather than paying out a cash benefit. Now, that's not to say the problem with that is if you're a middle income family that you don't owe a lot of taxes because the U.S. tends to be a pretty lightly taxed country. If you're a family making 40 or 50,000 U.S. dollars a year, you might not even owe that much in taxes to begin with. And so, if it's only a reduction in taxes, then you're kind of left out of this broader scheme. And so that's why we do have something. Sorry to make your listeners' eyes glaze
No.
over here, but we do have something called the additional child tax credit in the US, which is a cash payment, but it's smaller, it's scaled down, and it's really focused on sort of that, again, working class but lower income side of the spectrum. I think that's what we should in the US should be focusing on trying to boost. Unfortunately, this one big beautiful bill that just seems to be passing Congress as we speak doesn't do anything for the lower income, working class Americans. It's really skewed towards more of the upper income folks, and I think that was probably a mistake. But there's always
Yeah.
another.
Well, and it's interesting because the CCB does in fact treat the lower incomes level people better, but as you suggest, has a tapering off issue with middle income that could be fixed. Um, so I want to say the best of both worlds here is having a bit of the cash subsidy and then child tax credit in lieu of the subsidized daycare approach, which puts all of the eggs in one basket, and I think has some negative consequences when it's done at a certain scale for family and home life and that sort of thing. But let's return to the one big beautiful bill. Tell us about the CTC. You'll get the name right for me. What's going on there right now, and your assessment of it.
Well, it's big, that's for sure, and it's one, I guess. I don't know if I would certainly hesitate to qualify it as beautiful, but it was kind of a ticking time bomb. They had to pass something, so they knew that kind of whatever they could cram into this thing was going to go. So it's a modest increase in the child tax credit from a maximum of $2,000 per child to $2,200 per child. That's indexed to inflation, so that's actually an improvement on the U.S. system previous to now, which was just a flat amount. So every year you would see that erode over time. So that's something that again Canada does right, and we're now catching on, which I think was the right thing to do. There's other provisions to the safety net that I don't love. There's other things that some of the Planned Parenthood and gender transition and some of these other things that could have been a lot better that kind of got snuck in, but at a very small amount. So it was kind of a product of political necessity, and unfortunately that's how politics is sometimes.
Yes, very true. Okay. Well, let's talk now about the tax side of things and the parental leave. So, I mentioned earlier that the systems in Canada, in the US, are very different in this regard, in the fundamental way in which people are taxed. It's individualized in Canada, and in the US, you can file as a family. Can you just speak to the differences inherent in these approaches with respect to its effects on family formation and fertility?
Yeah, no, I think this is a real strength of the American system, and part of it is just because our tax system was designed whatever, early 1900s, and status quo bias means that there's little appetite to change it. And I think treating the family as a unit and saying whoever earns the income, whether it's mom or dad or the kid or whatever, however you want to structure it, is the right way to think about this, because the core building block of society is the household rather than the individual. And now, that cashes out in different ways. We as the US has, had this breakdown of the family, and there's been attempts to try to grapple with that. We've introduced things like the head of household exemption, which kind of rewards single parents relative to married ones. I think that's probably that is a mistake. I think, it would be nice to see someone try to fix that. There's other provisions, again, marriage penalties in the tax code that kind of work against this. But on the broad conceptual level, to me, it makes a lot more sense to say, let's respect the sanctity almost of the domestic castle, of the home, of however families want to live their lives. And I think the push, on the progressive side in the U.S. and internationally, we see countries do this too, to treat everybody as an individual when it comes to tax time, as well as elsewhere in family law and the rest. I think inadvertently, question mark, or maybe even advertently, eats away at that sense of the two becoming one, right? That how that family becoming a new corporate body in society rather than you just a roof that people happen to share. And so, you know, again, there's lots of ways that this breaks down, and reality is messy, and there's adoption and divorce and all these sort of things that don't fit into that necessarily perfectly. But if that's your model for how families should be treated, I think that points you in directions in certain ways when it comes to even things like assisted reproduction and some of these other sort of edge cases that get kind of messy. If we're saying, well, we're going to respect the bond of the family over just alienated, isolated individuals, I think that should influence how you think about
Mhm.
taxes, how you're treating benefits, and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Um, Staying on this question for a moment, have you done research, or some of your colleagues, maybe at the Institute for Family Studies, on the effect of just moving towards, and maybe it's less so in the U.S., maybe it's looking at other countries like Canada and European countries that have this individual tax system approach, of the effects of treating the dual income earning family as normative, and in particular, I'm thinking of the social health and well-being metrics here, like um, not having or cultivating a home life, and having at least one parent spend enough time with children, especially in their formative years, or even its effect on fertility. I imagine just having the dual income family become normative is also affecting fertility to a certain degree. What can you say about these issues?
It is, yeah. So the short answer is that's a fascinating thesis. I think it's tricky to identify it too carefully, just because you don't see like you need a control group and a comparison group, right? And like a lot of countries, there's so much going on, it's hard to compare across country lines. All that, we'll take this all with a grain of salt to say, I think that there's something to be said for a system that presumes both parents will be working full time. Again, the universal child care structure is a perfect example of this, but individual taxation is as well. And you mentioned Hungary earlier. They're sort of the poster child among certain conservatives for really aggressive pro family policy and under the Orban government. And they're limited in how effective they can be because of this scheme. So, for example, up until this year, they just lowered the threshold, but for the last couple of years now, it's been if you are a Hungarian woman and you have 4 kids, you don't pay income tax for the rest of your life. And so a lot of Americans and maybe some Canadians too were saying, oh, we should have this policy in the US as well. But but their system is closer to yours, where the number of Hungarian women who had 4 kids and then would go on to earn enough income to pay much income tax was actually very small. And so it wasn't surprising that there wasn't much of a, they've managed to level out their decline in fertility, which is an achievement, but it certainly has not come back up to anywhere close to replacement level, partially because of the structure of their tax system. And so something in the US would have to look very different. There's been some proposals in Hungary to make it more effective, and I hope that they work. It's an interesting test study for sure, but I think you're right to pinpoint this sense that the people making these decisions, whether in Ottawa or DC or Brussels or wherever, tend to be the type of people for whom work is an important source of meaning in their life, right? They show up and they can't wait to get back to the office the next day, and they assume that that's the case for them. Their job is their vocation, and maybe for all of us, we should all have some sense of this, but it's that sense of careerism is really strong. But again, when you talk to middle class Americans, we did a focus group, which was some polling. When you talk to people without a college degree, when you talk to people with a lot of kids, work is a job. It's a way to put money on the table. But once it's over, they're not on their BlackBerry or their cell phone checking their emails multiple times over the course of the night. They're just ready to go back and try to put more money on the table. It's not like it's not a source of deep seated identity in the same way that it is a lot of people making these choices. And so I think that cashes out in at how these systems are designed. And so a universal childcare system or an individual tax system that really rewards people working full time and maximizing income works for those people, but it doesn't match the preferences of folks from other walks of life.
Yeah, yeah, that's very true. And underneath all of this, of course, is yeah, profound changes in the foundational values that people hold. As you say, more and more people view work, or at least work, as a means to fulfilling other kind of individual experiential choice um, options in life as kind of the primary good, and uh, relationships of care and dependency are increasingly viewed as burdens, and children in particular. And this is a huge shift away from one that, and I think it's partly because there's such a network effect going on here, a social network effect. If you're around other people with families and children, and you see that, oh, it's just good, and makes them happy and everything, you're more likely to want to do it. But people don't see that, and so they just see it as a bit of a burden, and it's a discouragement. So I think, yeah, a lot of this has to do ultimately with the way we conceive of what life's all about. Um,
Well, yeah, and I'll just add, when you started talking about burdens in the social fabric, I immediately jumped to what assisted dying looks like in Canada right now, in the
mhm,
sense that the best thing to do when you get to a certain age and a certain level of dependency is to, is a track two or whatever, and that's clearly the way that a lot of the West is going. And when we lose that sense of that the sort of dependency along the life cycle, that when you're very young you're dependent on your parents for diaper changes and food and all the rest, and then as you get older you just start to depend on your kids. Once we start losing the sense of the family and that sense of interconnectedness, the natural outgrowth is to say, well, the best thing I can do for my kids and for my loved ones is to just remove myself from the situation. It's a tragedy, and it's something that I think on both ends of the spectrum we're seeing that lessening of of that sense of
mhm.
obligation and a more sense of autonomy and control.
Okay. Um, so kind of sizing it all up now. I mean, well, there was one other thing we didn't talk about, which is parental leave. Canada has more generous parental leave as well in the U.S. So I'd welcome your comment on that. But weighing it all up on both sides of the ledger here. I mean, Canada has that. We have the CCB. We have even this universal child care, which I think in fact is a net drag on fertility, because of the strong incentives to work. Um, but you look at all of these things, the CCB and the parental leave in particular being pretty significant, and then you compare with the U.S. and you look at the fertility rates and even the marriage rates, and it doesn't quite add up, right? So we lag the U.S. in many respects. I think our fertility rates 1.2, the U.S. is 1.6, and so perhaps there are more important things in the policy or cultural matrix that make a difference here. I'm wondering, in light of all we've discussed thus far, what do you think these difference makers are?
Yeah, I mean that is the multi-trillion-dollar question across the globe, right? I mean, you look at, for a long time, I think folks on the left would point to Scandinavia and say, look, they have every form of social spending you could think of maxed out 10 times, and in the recent years their fertility rates have slumped down to about where we are in the US, if not below. Canada, obviously, another good example. There's plenty of developed Western nations that certainly don't. The critique from the U.S. is, well, if you want more babies, like why aren't you supporting parents? Why aren't you putting your money where your mouth is? And I think there's a at this point enough evidence from across the globe that that is not enough, and that it is good. I think I don't want to gainsay the importance of some of this stuff. Right, parental leave I think is actually very there's almost a claim on justice to make sure that new moms specifically, when they give birth and they're still recovering and physically and emotionally and all that sort of stuff. In the U.S., you're not guaranteed anything in terms of either unpaid or paid leave. A lot of people don't even have, they have to bank up time away from work and that sort of thing. I think that's cruel. I think it's not right that new moms would have to go back to work a couple days or a couple weeks after baby's born. I think it's good to do. But it's not a pronatal measure in the sense that when you have that in place, and there are states in the US, some states in the US that do, their birth rates are lower than states that don't, right? So it's supporting parents and supporting new moms and families is not the same as increasing the birth rate. It's important to keep those, some of them kind of overlap in terms of policies, but for the most part, they're distinct conversations, and we should be open about that. And if you're concerned about birth rates, which I think we all should be, then it is much more of a cultural conversation. Economics does play a role, and certainly upfront assistance for new parents helps, and all the rest. But it's ultimately about the stuff we were talking about earlier, religion. There's some speculative work that suggests that places with more racial diversity and higher rates of recent influxes of immigration have lower birth rates and lower rates of social capital. I that's way beyond my expertise to lay a claim on one way or the other, but it's plausible. And certainly, again, that sort of consumerism. That's something not that policy has a super, fine-tuned ability to change, but that mentality that, like, what matters most in life is the size of your bank account or the number of trips you've taken to Bali and Indonesia or brunch on Sundays or whatever else, rather than the quality of your relationships and your interconnectedness with your community. That's a social change that we have to reverse in order to have any hope of restoring birth rates to what,
Mm,
something closer to replacement level.
okay. Um, Before we shift, there's one thing we didn't talk about, which is housing. Housing is a bit of a factor here. I mean, I'm thinking, maybe it's a certain type of person moves toward some more family friendly areas, because I think, as you've just said, a lot of these cultural issues are in fact more important, as well as some of the pro fertility, not family support policies that we've talked about. But you see this red state exodus or sorry, blue state exodus toward red states, particularly among families, places like Texas and Florida, where one of the attractive things is that they make land available um, outside of cities for the types of housing that families want. Like, we know this is the same in Canada and as in the US, as well as other European countries, that look, like, you don't want to live in shoebox apartments in downtown. And you see this in some countries that have invested a lot into the housing side of this equation, but ignored the type part of it. Like in Japan, a great example. They're able to get a lot of housing built now, but it's in incredibly dense areas, and so their fertility rate is not affected at all. I'm wondering what you think about housing policy and housing type in particular, land use regulations, all that, and how it factors into this equation.
Yeah, no, that's a really complex, interesting, fascinating question that we could spend an hour on. But in brief, there is definitely a direct relationship between housing affordability and birth rates. We know this from history. Part of the driver of the baby boom in the post World War II era was the availability of 30-year mortgages in the US, and the expansion of the housing supply. We're building just suburbs like you wouldn't believe for decades until the 1970s, when there was a concerted push to make it harder to build. Environmental laws, red tape, zoning regulations all started to really kick in and make it a lot harder to build. And uh, part of the reason was because there was a vested interest among homeowners to say, now my home is really my nest egg in a sense. And as my housing value goes up, if there's more housing that's built around me, that threatens my ability to save for retirement and all the rest. And it's a very natural human instinct to be a little risk averse when it comes to something that's such a huge investment for a lot of people. And so there was a concerted push in the 70s and 80s to make it harder to build in America. And I think you see this in other countries as well. Um, and so now, with the rise of the YIMBY movement and the abundance mindset and some of these other things, not all of which I sign on to wholeheartedly, but there's a recognition that the scale went way too far on that side. And we need to make it easier to build both uh, out and up. And you're right to notice that families are not the ones who are signing up for a studio apartment in downtown Toronto or the San Francisco Bay Area or something. They Families tend to want something with a little more room, a yard for the kids to run around, and that sort of thing. It's not an either or though. And by allowing downtown areas to densify, at least in the US, I'm not worried about us becoming Japan anytime soon. We got plenty of room. Allowing downtown areas to densify and to build some of these studio apartments, you relieve some of the pressure on the suburbs and the exurbs, and allow the market to clear a little bit better. It's both and finding ways to whether it's softening zoning regulations to allow mother-in-law units or duplexes on infill land, or loosening environmental relations to be able to build further out than traditionally available. That kind of stuff is really important. It is essential to make housing more affordable to more people. There's one I'll just example I'll throw out is the city of Vancouver, BC, which a lot of people point to as a kind of interesting case study because it is an outrageously expensive place to live, and obviously, again, very high demand influx in recent years. They've actually, as far as I understand, set a threshold of new apartments being built have to be sort of considered as family friendly, have 2 bedrooms or more. The problem with this is, I mean, in theory, it's a great idea. The problem is, if that were to be adopted sort of as a solution to some of this stuff, you're never going to get past the fundamental problem, which is a household, especially if they have a single earner, is always going to have more dependence to, if you have kids, they have a harder time making rent than, a collection of roommates, right? In that same, the 2 or 3 adults sharing a family friendly apartment is just going to be able to outbid a single or dual earner family. And so it's an interesting idea, but ultimately market forces are going to be what you have to work with rather than work against. And
Hmm.
so, yes, in my backyard and everybody else's backyard too.
Okay, fascinating. So let's shift gears now to the big picture differences in perspective, let's say, among left and right, but so definitely among left and right, but also within the right. With respect to some of these issues, there's certainly a tension going on, more so on the right, between the use of government and some measures that have a cost to them on these sorts of issues. um, but I wonder, especially with some of the long term fiscal impacts of declining birth rates, particularly on social service and entitlement um, longevity, where this debate is at right now. Are you seeing some convergence on certain issues, or still significant differences?
Yeah. Man. Like I just said, we're in the middle of passing this one big, beautiful bill, and it would add, I think, $4 trillion, or give or take a trillion or so, to the U.S. federal deficit over the next 10 years. And as a matter of just sort of generational equity, I really cringe at that, because that is, even if you don't have to pay it all back, even if it's, there's plenty of foreign investors who will buy U.S. Treasury bonds, it still crowds out private investment. It's still a dead weight on society. It's still interest payments we got to pay off, and so, you know, and in constructing that, the way they designed it was expanding a tax deduction for seniors, I think to the tune of $6,000, that you can, deduct if you're over a certain age. Again, compared that to a $200 bump in the child tax credit, it just shows you where the votes are, shows you where the political coalition is. In the right, in the U.S. especially, it tends to be skewed heavily towards the elderly. Now, there's interesting polling suggesting that Generation Z is actually more open to some conservative ideas than Gen X and millennials are, but overall, the bill reflects where the right is, which is, kind of a more older part of the spectrum. People weren't having babies anymore, and so that's a challenge for some of this stuff. We, but as your question points out, over if you just shrug your shoulders over the long term and say, well, there's immigration, or there's, artificial wombs coming down the pipeline, we don't need to worry about this. That's not a conservative movement that I'm interested in being part of. And so there's interesting fissures in the right that are, saying, well, let's be willing to spend more money on families and a baby bonus or some other ways of getting, trying to help people have kids rather than just, expanding Social Security benefits for the retired. It's not a battle we're winning right now on the right, unfortunately, but I think generationally, the politicians and the thinkers who are most interested in trying to be more creative about this tend to be the younger ones, tend to be
Mhm.
the ones who will have control of the party, hopefully 5 or 10 years down the line, if they don't have the influence right now.
Fascinating. What about on the left? I notice in recent weeks, even, you know, articles in the New York Times and other places with some interesting lenses, I would say, on this issue. But at least, finally, I would say acknowledging the fertility and family formation issue for what it is. What sort of signs do you see on different parts of the political spectrum on this issue?
Yeah, no, I think you're right to notice that. I think for a long time, talking about birth rates got you kind of like, the heebie-jeebies from folks on the left. Oh, isn't this just patriarchy or, white supremacy or whatever else? That seems to be it's still there. Don't get me wrong, but it seems to be fading. I think the trick for the left is, again, especially in the U.S. context, they have no issue spending money. That is clear. They had their own version of a giant stimulus plan that didn't get passed under the Biden administration, the Build Back Better approach. But they're not afraid of spending money on childcare and even child tax credit and some of the stuff that I do support. The issue is the normative claim that it's better to get married than not. That it's better to have kids, to have a society that's having kids than one that is essentially going out of existence. That it's better to encourage people to form stable, lifelong relationships rather than sort of serial monogamy and cohabitation and all the rest. That is a bullet that some are willing to bite. It's still not the modal, person on the left. And until you're willing to speak frankly about the relationship between marriage and happiness and childbirth, and again, I think religion plays a key role here. I think you're going to have a really hard time making the sort of value neutral case for pro family, pro natal policy. Some try to do it, some do it better than others, but on the left in general, I think that's the hurdle they have to get over.
Wow, yeah, it's just shocking. The lessons not yet being learned. It seems reality remains a distant concept. But interesting you say like because I think I heard one of your collaborators, Brad Wilcox, say this that many, particularly the more educated, more often liberal, left wing people, they talk left but walk right, especially when it comes to marriage and family formation. Is that a sort of disconnect you see? Is cognitive dissonance going on, or I mean, they're not conceiving it in the same kind of way, but is there?
Yeah, I mean, there's so just to recap, Brad's thesis is that the cultural left is all about family diversity and polycules and polyamory and all sorts of untraditional approaches to family life. But when it comes down to it, they're still the ones who are getting married, which is true. They're the ones who are going to college in general, and college educated Americans still have much higher, or today they have much higher rates of getting married than non-college Americans do. This is a flip of where it was 40, 50 years ago. So that's an interesting data point, right? I think part of what we've done as a society, both in the US and across the globe, look at Venice last weekend with the CEO of Amazon and his lovely bride. We've turned weddings and marriages into essentially a giant party that is confirming something that's already the case. Most people live together before marriage. Uh, College educated couples particularly are getting married much later in life than they used to, but it's sort of a symbol now that, like, well, now let's throw ourselves a big party because we've passed through young adulthood, our relationship has gone the distance, we're ready to settle down and start having kids, and a lot of them do. That's why fertility rates among college educated couples, although they are lower than non-college Americans, they're steady and they're not dropping at the same rate that non-college Americans are. And I think that is a reason we've raised the threshold from getting married to having to find Mr. Perfect and Mrs. Right. And that's just something that a lot of non-college Americans don't feel like they can, or don't feel like they ever will. And so maybe they have a baby out of wedlock, maybe they cohabitate for a while, but a lot of them are just living single, unhappy lives, and that's not a fate anyone should wish on those people. We want young men to be the type of person worth marrying. We want young women to find the person who's willing to provide for them in a substantial way. And you mentioned, whether that's a rebirth of industrial jobs or rethinking our approach to K-12 and post-secondary education. Something has gone wrong with the way that we equip young men to launch into the real world. And especially for those who aren't going to college, there aren't good scripts to become that provider figure. And so until we figure that out, I think, it used to be maybe churches and other institutions of civil society would provide that for them. But if they're not going to church and they're spending their time playing Fortnite and, buying weed and whatever else, that is a real challenge. And until we figure out how to solve that, I think that is one of the most fundamental drivers of the breakdown between the sexes and why people aren't getting married and aren't having kids.
Hmm. Fascinating. One final question I'll leave you with, Pat. Recommendations for both the United States and Canada on this file. What are some of the major policy proposals or non policy proposals that you'd recommend?
Well, as I mentioned before, I'd love to see Canada maybe take a keener eye towards work disincentives and marriage disincentives in some of their safety net programs. The problem with being too generous for low income individuals is that you can build on these cliffs. Now, I don't think they're as significant up there as they are down here, but you have to do the math, and sometimes you see the case that similarly situated couples, one cohabiting, one not, they'll get more benefits. I think that, you got to try to weed those out wherever possible. That makes a little difference on the margin. And similar, the child benefit, smoothing it out so it's more universal, so big families aren't penalized. I think that's pretty much a given from my point of view. We should support and encourage big families rather than tapering their benefits. And then, culturally, I think, Canada is going through, an identity crisis. And there's at least from my outsider's perspective, there seems to be a real lack of confidence about what Canada stands for and what it means to be a Canadian in the 21st century. You know, maybe right now we're not the 51st state, and that'll get you, part of the way. But figuring out why it's good to have more Canadians, and why it's a warning sign that people aren't willing to repopulate themselves. There's cringy ways to go about this. You look at some of the South Asian countries and what they've tried to do to birth rates, and it can be kind of humorous at times. But there's got to be messaging coming from the top and from popular media about the importance of family and the importance of a society that sees value in existing and being committed to others and serving, uh, rather than just living a life of individual consumption. On the US, again, I think there's some things we can learn from you guys in terms of being willing to put your money where your mouth is in trying to support kids and families. We could also do better with weeding out some of these marriage penalties as well. But I think there are healthy subcultures in the US where you know, most Americans still at least pay lip service to the idea of wanting to support marriage and families, even if they don't always live that out their lives. The loud voices that are saying, sort of anti-natal, I think tend to be more fringy, very online folks. And so it's just a matter of aligning our rhetoric with where our policy is, at least on the right. It doesn't look like the one big beautiful bill, but there are other policy ideas in Congress that could make America a more pro-family country. And I hope that the Trump administration and whoever else follows them
Mhm.
takes those ideas seriously.
Well, very good. Lots of advice for policymakers on both sides of the border. It's been a pleasure having you, Patrick. Patrick is, again, a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington. I encourage you to check out his work there and on his Substack, Family Matters. It's great stuff. I'm Peter Copeland for Inside Policy Talks. Thanks for being with us, Pat.
Thank you.